Chapter 2 The Alienated Ego. Danger itself fosters the rescuing power. Holderin. The ego self-axis and the psychic life. Although the ego begins in a state of inflation due to identification with the self, this condition cannot persist. Encounters with reality frustrate inflated expectations and bring about an estrangement between ego and self. This estrangement is symbolized by such images as a fall, an exile, an unhealing wound, a perpetual torture. Obviously, when such images come into play, not only has the ego been chastened, it has been injured. This injury can be best understood as a damage to the ego self-axis, a concept which now requires further discussion. Clinical observation leads one to the conclusion that the integrity and stability of the ego depend in all stages of development on a living connection with the self. Fordham gives examples of mandala images in children which emerge as magical protective circles at times when the ego is threatened by disruptive forces. He also cites several occasions with children when the drawing of a circle was associated with the word I, and which led to some effective action the child had previously been unable to take. A similar occurrence takes place in the psychotherapy of adults, when the unconscious may produce a mandala image which conveys a sense of calm and containment to a disordered and confused ego. These observations indicate that the self stands behind the ego and can act as a guarantor of its integrity. Jung expresses the same idea when he says, quote, "The ego stands to the self as the move to the mover. The self is an a priori existent out of which the ego evolves. It is, so to speak, an unconscious prefiguration of the ego." Close quote. Thus ego and self have a close structural and dynamic affinity. The term ego self-axis has been used by Newman to designate the vital affinity. This ego-self affinity is illustrated mythologically by the Old Testament doctrine that man, ego, was created in God's, the self's, image. Also pertinent is the primordial name ascribed to Yahweh, I am that I am. Do not the words I am also define the essential nature of the ego? We, therefore, seem on firm ground when we postulate a basic connection between ego and self that is of crucial importance for maintaining the function and integrity of the ego. This connection is depicted in the diagrams on page 5 by the line connecting the center of the ego circle with the center of the self circle and labeled ego self-axis. The ego self-axis represents the vital connection between ego and self that must be relatively intact if the ego is to survive stress and grow. This axis is the gateway or path of communication between the conscious personality and the archetypal psyche. Damage to the ego self-axis impairs or destroys the connection between conscious and unconscious, leading to alienation of the ego from its origin and foundation. Before we consider how damage to the ego self-axis occurs in childhood, a few preliminary remarks are necessary. Every archetypal image carries at least a partial aspect of the self. In the unconscious, there is no separation of different things. Everything emerges with everything else. Thus, as long as the individual is unconscious of them, the successive layers we have learned to distinguish, i.e., shadow, animus or anima, and self, are not separated, but merged in one dynamic totality. Behind a shadow or animus problem or apparent problem will lurk the dynamism of the self. Since the self is the central archetype, it subordinates all other archetypal dominants. It surrounds and contains them. All problems of alienation, whether it be alienation between ego and parent figures, between ego and shadow, or between ego and anima, or animus, are thus ultimately alienation between ego and self. Although we separate these different figures for descriptive purposes, in empirical experience they are not usually separated. In all serious psychological problems, we are therefore dealing basically with the question of the ego-self relationship. This is particularly true of the child's psychology. Newman has suggested that the self may be experienced in childhood in relation to the parents, initially the mother. Newman calls the original mother-child relationship the primary relationship and says, quote, "In the primary relationship, the mother as the directing, protecting, and nourishing source represents the unconscious, and, in the first phase, also the self, and the dependent child represents the childish ego and consciousness." Close quote. This means simply that the self is inevitably experienced initially in projection onto the parents. Thus, the early phase of the developing ego-self axis may be indicated with the relationship between parents and child. It is precisely at this point that we must be particularly careful to do justice to both the personal historical factors and also the a priori archetypal factors. The self is an a priori inner determinant. However, it cannot emerge without a concrete parent-child relationship. Newman has drawn attention to this and calls it the personal evocation of the archetype. During this phase of experiencing the self in projection, the ego-self axis is likely to be most vulnerable to damage by adverse environmental influence. At this time, what is within and what is without cannot be distinguished. Therefore, inability to experience acceptance or rapport is felt to be identical with the loss of acceptance by the self. In other words, the ego-self axis has been damaged, causing ego-self alienation. The part has become separated from the whole. This experience of parental rejection of some aspect of the child's personality is a part of the anamnesis of almost every patient in psychotherapy. By the word rejection, I do not mean the necessary training and discipline of the child that teaches him to restrain his primitive desirousness. I refer rather to the parental rejection that stems from the projection of the parent's shadow onto the child. This is an unconscious process experienced by the child as something inhuman, total, and irrevocable. It seems to come from a place of implacid deity. This appearance has two origins. In the first place, the child's projection of the self onto the parent will give that parent's actions a transpersonal importance. Secondly, the rejecting parent who is functioning unconsciously will be acting in his own area of ego self-identity and will therefore be inflated in an identification with deity. The consequence from the child's standpoint is damage to his ego self-axis that may cripple his psyche permanently. The self as the center and totality of the psyche which is able to reconcile all opposites can be considered as the organ of acceptance par excellence. Since it includes the totality, it must be able to accept all elements of psychic life, no matter how antithetical they may be. It is this sense of acceptance of the self that gives the ego its strength and stability. This sense of acceptance is conveyed to the ego via the ego-self axis. A symptom of damage to this axis is lack of self-acceptance. The individual feels he is not worthy to exist or be himself. Psychotherapy offers such a person an opportunity to experience acceptance. In successful cases, this can amount to the repair of the ego-self axis, which restores contact with the inner sources of strength and acceptance, leaving the patient free to live and grow. Patients with a damaged ego-self axis are not impressed in a psychotherapy by the discovery that the therapist accepts them. Initially, they cannot believe it. The fact of acceptance may be discredited by considering it only a professional technique having no genuine reality. However, if the acceptance of the therapist can be recognized as a fact, and powerful transference promptly appears. The source of this transference seems to be the projection of the self, especially in its function as the organ of acceptance. At this point, the central characteristics of the therapist's self become prominent. The therapist as a person becomes the center of the patient's life and thoughts. The therapy sessions become the central points of the week. A center of meaning and order has appeared where previously there was chaos and despair. These phenomena indicate a repair of the ego-self axis is occurring. Meetings with the therapist will be experienced as as a rejuvenating contact with life, which conveys a sense of hope and optimism. At first, such effects require frequent contact and wane quickly between sessions. Gradually, however, the inner aspect of the ego-self axis becomes increasingly prominent. The experience of acceptance not only repairs the ego-self axis but also reactivates residual ego-self identity. This is bound to occur as long as the ego-self axis is completely unconscious, condition represented by Figure 2. Hence inflated attitudes, possessive expectations, etc. will emerge which evoke further rejection from therapist or environment. Once again, the ego-self axis will be damaged, producing a condition of relative alienation. Ideally, in psychotherapy and in natural development, one would hope for a progressive dissolution of ego-self identity so gentle that it would cause no damage to the ego-self axis. In actuality, this desirable condition scarcely ever occurs. The process of the development of consciousness seems to follow the cyclical course represented in Figure 5, page 41. As indicated in the diagram, psychic growth involves a series of inflated or heroic acts. These provoke rejection and are followed by alienation, repentance, restitution, and renewed inflation. This cyclical process repeats itself again and again in the early phases of psychological development, each cycle producing an increment of consciousness. Thus, gradually consciousness is built up. However, the cycle can go wrong. It is subject to disturbances, especially in the early phases of life. In childhood, the child's connection with the self is largely identical with his relation to the parents. Hence, if this relationship is faulty, the child's contact with his inner center of being will likewise be faulty. It is this fact that makes early family relationships so crucially important in personality development. If the interpersonal family relationships are too damaging, the cycle may be almost completely interrupted. It may be interrupted in two places. A block can develop if sufficient acceptance and renewal of love does not occur at point A. If the child is not fully accepted after punishment for misbehavior, the growth cycle can be short-circuited. Instead of completing the cycle and reaching the position of rest and re-acceptance, the child's ego can be caught in a sterile oscillation between inflation and alienation that builds up more and more frustration and despair. Another place a block can occur is at point B. If the environment of the child is so totally permissive that he has no significant rejection experiences at all, if the parents never say no, that also short-circuits the cycle. The whole experience of alienation, which brings consciousness with it, is omitted, and the child gets acceptance for his inflation. That leads to the spoiled child psychology and contributes to the provisional life in which limitations and rejections have scarcely been experienced at all. Figure 5 represents the alternation between inflation and alienation occurring in the early stages. It leaves out of account the later stage of development when the cycle is superseded. Once the ego has reached a certain level of development, it does not have to continue this repetitious cycle, at least not in the same way. The cycle is then replaced by a more or less conscious dialogue between ego and self. 2. Despair and violence. In the state of alienation, the ego is not only disidentified from the self, which is desirable, but it is also disconnected from it, which is most undesirable. The connection between ego and self is vitally important to psychic health. It gives foundation, structure, and security to the ego and also provides energy, interest, meaning, and purpose. When the connection is broken, the result is emptiness, despair, meaninglessness, and in extreme cases, psychosis or suicide. The Bible presents several mythological figures representing the state of alienation. Adam and Eve are sad and estranged figures as they are expelled from the garden. Also Cain is a figure of alienation. We read in Genesis, "Now Abel was a keeper of sheep. and Cain a tiller of the ground. In the course of time Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel brought of the firstlings of his flock and their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and in his countenance fell. The Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? Yahweh does not seem to realize that it was his own rejection of Cain and his offering that has caused the whole trouble. Cain said to Abel his brother, Let us go out to the field. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, Where is Abel, your brother? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Thus Cain is banished to the wilderness, reenacting on another level Adam's banishment from paradise. If we look at this myth objectively rather than traditionally, we see that the origin of the difficulty was God's rejection of Cain without apparent cause or reason. We are told that Abel was a keeper of sheep and Cain a tiller of the ground. Perhaps Cain was initiating agriculture in a society of herders. This could account for Cain's rejection. He was an innovator and suffered the characteristic fate of all who attempt to bring a new orientation to a fixed society that is fearful of change. At any rate, Cain is an archetypal figure representing the experience of rejection and alienation. His reaction to an excessive and irrational rejection is characteristic, namely, violence. Whenever one experiences an unbearable alienation and despair, it is followed by violence. The violence can take either an external or an internal form. In extreme forms, this means either murder or suicide. The crucial point is that at the root of violence of any form lies the experience of alienation, a rejection too severe to be endured. I recall a patient I encountered in a mental hospital who lived out the Cain myth. From earliest childhood, his greatest problem and the central theme of his life experience was rivalry with his older brother. His brother was successful in everything he put his hand to and was the favorite of both parents. This favoritism was so pronounced that the parents commonly referred to the patient by his brother's name. This, quite understandably, infuriated him, meaning, as it did, that he was not experienced as a separate individual and scarcely existed in their eyes. The patient was left in a state of bitterness and frustration with a sense of utter worthlessness. How identified he was with the rejected one was revealed by his reaction one time while attending a movie, East of Eden, based on the novel by John Steinbeck. This story is a modernized form of the Cain and Abel theme. There are two brothers in the story, one the favorite of the father and the other neglected and rejected. The patient identified powerfully with the rejected brother and in the midst of the movie had such an extreme reaction of anxiety and distress that he was forced to leave. Later the patient married, but things did not go well between him and his wife. His wife had an affair with another man. This situation then provoked the old rejection theme in full intensity, and he made a murderous assault on his wife but did not kill her. Later he attempted suicide. It was unsuccessful the first time, but finally, on the third try, he succeeded. Thus he lived out his mythological fate to the bitter end. From the inner standpoint, this is very little difference between murder and suicide. The only difference is in the direction in which the destructive energy is moving. In the depressed state, one often encounters murderous dreams. The dreamer murders himself internally. Such dream images indicate that murder and suicide are essentially the same thing symbolically. Another biblical figure, likewise a typical representation of the alienated state, is Ishmael. Ishmael was the illegitimate son of Abraham by the bondwoman Hagar. When Isaac, the legitimate son, was born, Ishmael and his mother were cast out into the desert. The theme of illegitimacy is an aspect of the alienation experience. Actual illegitimate children usually have a severe alienation problem, what might be called an Ishmael complex. Melville's book, Moby Dick, is a beautiful example of the working out of an Ishmael complex. The name of the central character is Ishmael, and the story depicts an alternation between the states of inflation and alienation. The first paragraph of Moby Dick reads, "Called me Ishmael, some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no money in my purse, and nothing particular to interest me on shore. I thought I would sail about a little sea, the watery part of the world. It is a way I have of driving off the spleen and regulating the circulation. Whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever I find myself involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses and bringing up the rear of every funeral I meet, and especially whenever my hypos get such an upper hand of me that it requires a strong moral principle to prevent me from deliberately stepping into the street and methodically knocking people's hats off, then I count it high time to get to sea as soon as I can. This is my substitute for pistol and ball." With a philosophical flourish, Cato throws himself upon his sword. I quietly take to the ship. There is nothing surprising in this. If they but knew it, almost all men in their degree, some time or other, cherish very nearly the same feelings toward the ocean with me. Everything that happens in the book follows logically from this first paragraph. The whole tragic drama of violence and inflation unfolds out of the initial state of alienated suicidal despair. It is an example of short-circuited cycle, a state of alienation that leads back to renewed inflation, having its consequences still more disastrous. Other literary classics also begin with a state of alienation. Dante's Divine Comedy begins with these lines: "Midway upon the journey of our life, I found that I was in a dusky wood, for the right path, whence I had strayed, was lost. Ah, me! How hard a thing is to tell, the wildness of that rough and savage place, the very thought of which brings back my fear. So bitter was it, death is a little more so." Goethe's Faust likewise begins in a state of alienation. In the first scene he expresses his emptiness and sterility. "Oh, am I stuck in this jail, this god-damned dreary hole in the wall, where even the lovely light of heaven breaks wanly through the painted panes, cooped up among these heaps of books, gnawed by worms, coated with dust." Hölderlin expresses the transition from child to adult as from heaven to wasteland. "Blessed be childhood's golden dreams, their power hid from my life's dismal poverty, hid from all the heart's good seeds he brought to flower. Things I could not reach, ye gave to me. In thy beauty and thy light, O nature, of all effort and compulsion free, fruitful, love attained a kingly stature, rich as harvested, reaped in Arcadia. That which brought me up is dead and riven, dead the youthful world which was my shield, and this breast which was used to harbor heaven, dead and dry as any stubble field. We do not lack for modern expressions of the alienated state. In fact, they are so ubiquitous our time could well be called the age of alienation. Consider, for instance, these passages from T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land. "What are the roots that clutch, what branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images, where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. Here is no water but only rock, rock and no water, and the sandy road, the road winding above among the mountains. which are mountains of rock without water. If there were water, we should stop and drink. Amongst the rock one cannot stop or think. Sweet is dry, and feet are in the sand. If there were only water amongst the rock. Dead mountain, mouth of carious teeth that cannot spit. Here one can neither stand nor lie nor sit. There is not even silence in the mountains, but dry and sterile thunder without rain. There is not even solitude in the mountains, but red sullen faces sneer and snarl from doors of mud-cracked houses. This powerful poem expresses the individual collective alienation that is characteristic of our time. The heap of broken images surely refers to the traditional religious symbols which for many people have lost their meaning. We live in a desert and cannot find the source of life-giving water. The mountains, originally the place where man met God, have nothing but dry, sterile thunder without rain. Modern existentialism can be considered as symptomatic of the collective alienation. Many current novels and plays depict lost, meaningless lives. The modern artist seems forced to depict again and again to bring home to all of us the experience of meaninglessness. However, this need is not to be considered a totally negative phenomenon. Alienation is not a dead end. Hopefully, it can lead to a greater awareness of the heights and depths of life. 3. Alienation and the religious experience. Just as the experience of active inflation is a necessary accompaniment of ego development, so the experience of alienation is a necessary prelude to awareness of the self. Kierkegaard, the fountainhead of modern existentialism, recognized the meaning of the alienation between experience in this passage. So much is said about wasted lives, but only the man's life is wasted who lived on, so deceived by the joys of life, or by its sorrow, that he never became eternally, decisively conscious of himself as spirit, or, what is the same thing, never became aware in the deepest sense received an impression of the fact that there is a God, and that he himself, exists before this God, which gain of infinity is never attained except through despair. Jung says essentially the same thing in psychological terms. The self, in its efforts at self-realization, reaches out beyond the ego personality on all sides. Because of its all-encompassing nature, it is brighter and darker than the ego, and accordingly confronts it with problems which it would like to avoid. Either one's moral courage fails, or one's insight, or both, until in the end fate decides. You have become the victim of a decision made over your head or in the defiance of the heart. From this we can see the numinous power of the self, which can hardly be experienced in any other way. For this reason, the experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego. There are numerous descriptions of religious experiences which typically are preceded by what St. John of the Cross called the dark night of the soul, what Kierkegaard called despair, and what Jung called defeat of the ego. All these terms refer to the same psychological state of alienation. We find again and again in the documentation of religious experiences a profound sense of depression, guilt, sin, unworthiness, and a complete absence of any sense of transpersonal support or foundation for one's existence to rest upon. The classical symbol for alienation is the image of the wilderness, and it is here, characteristically, that some manifestation of God is encountered. When the wanderer lost in the desert is about to perish, a source of divine nourishment appears. The Israelites in the wilderness are fed by manna from heaven. Elijah in the wilderness is fed by ravens. According to the legend, the desert hermit St. Paul was likewise fed by a raven. Psychologically, this means that the experience of the supporting aspect of the archetypal psyche is most likely to occur when the ego has exhausted its own resources and is aware of the essential impotence by itself. Man's extremity is God's opportunity. William James, in his book Varieties of Religious Experience, gives a number of examples of the state of alienation that precedes a numinous experience. One of the cases he discusses is that of Tolstoy. At about the age of 50, Tolstoy relates that he began to have moments of perplexity, of what he calls arrest, as if he knew not how to live or what to do. It is obvious that these were moments in which the excitement and interest which our functions naturally bring had ceased. Life had been enchanting. It was now flat, sober, more than sober, dead. Things were meaningless, whose meaning had always been self-evident. The question, why and what next, began to beset him more and more frequently. At first it seemed as if such questions must be answerable, and if he could easily find the answers, if he would take the time. But as they ever became more urgent, he perceives that it was like those first discomforts of a sick man, to which he pays but little attention till they run into one's continuous suffering, and then he realizes what he took for a passing disorder means the most momentous thing in the world for him, means his death. These questions, why, wherefore, what for, found no response. I felt, says Tolstoy, that something had broken within me on which my life had always rested, that I had nothing left to hold on to, and that morally my life had stopped. An invincible force impelled me to get rid of my existence in one way or another. It cannot be said exactly that I wished to kill myself, for the force which drew me away from life was fuller, more powerful, more general than any mere desire. It was a force like my old aspiration to live, only it impelled me in the opposite direction. It was an aspiration of my whole being to get out of life. Behold me then, a man happy and in good health, hiding the rope in order to hang myself to the rafters of the room where every night I went to sleep alone. Behold me no longer going shooting, lest I should yield to the too easy temptation of putting an end to myself with my gun. I did not know what I wanted. I was afraid of life. I was driven to leave it, and in spite of that, I still hoped something from it. All this took place at a time when, so far as my outer circumstances went, I ought to have been completely happy. I had a good wife who loved me and whom I loved, good children, and a large property which was increasing with no pains taken on my part. I was more respected by my kinfolk and acquaintances than I had ever been. I was loaded with praise by strangers, and without exaggeration I could believe my name already famous. Moreover, I was neither insane nor ill. On the contrary, I possessed a physical and mental strength which I had rarely met in persons of my age. I could mow as well as the peasants, I could work with my brain 8 hours uninterruptedly and feel no bad effects. And yet I could give no reasonable meaning to any actions of my life, and I was surprised that I had not understood this from the very beginning. My state of mind was as if some wicked and stupid jest was being played upon me by some one. One can live only so long as one is intoxicated, drunk with life, but when one grows sober one cannot fail to see that it is all a stupid cheat. What is truest about it is that there is nothing even funny or silly in it. It is cruel and stupid, purely and simply. He is beset with unanswerable questions. What will be the outcome of what I do today? Or what shall I do tomorrow? What will be the outcome of all my life? Why should I live? Why should I do anything? Is there in life any purpose which the inevitable death which awaits me does not undo and destroy? These questions are the simplest in the world. From the stupid child to the wisest old man, they are in the soul of every human being. Without an answer to them, it is impossible, as I experienced, for life to go on. This is a good example of an acute attack of alienation. The questions that Tolstoy asks are the same questions that lie at the root of every neurosis which develops in the mature years. Hence Jung can say that he has never seen a patient past the age of 35 who was cured without finding a religious attitude towards life. A religious attitude, understood psychologically, is based on an experience of the numinous, i.e., the self, but it is impossible for the ego to experience the self as something separate as long as the ego is unconsciously identified with the self. This explains the need for the alienation experience as a prelude to the religious experience. The ego must be disidentified from the self before the self can be encountered as the other. As long as one is unconsciously identified with God, he cannot experience his existence. But the process of ego self-separation causes alienation because loss of ego self-identity also involves damage to the ego self-axis. Hence, the typical dark night of the soul that precedes is the numinous experience. Another example is John Bunyan's description of his alienated state as reported by James. Quote, "But my original and inward pollution, that was my plague and my affliction. By reason of that, I was more loathsome in my own eyes than was a toad. And I thought I was so in God's eyes too. Sin and corruption, I said, would as naturally bubble out of my heart as water would bubble out of a fountain. I could have changed heart with anybody. I thought none but the devil himself could equal me for inward wickedness and pollution of mind. Sure, thought I am forsaken of God, and thus I continued a long while, even for some years together. And now I was sorry that God had made me a man. The beasts, birds, fishes, etc., I blessed their condition, for they had not a sinful nature. They were not obnoxious to the wrath of God. They were not to go to hell fire of after death. I could therefore have rejoiced, had my condition been as any of theirs. Now I bless the condition of the dog and toad. Yea, gladly would I have been in the condition of the dog or horse, for I knew they had no soul to perish under the everlasting weight of hell or sin, as mine was like to do. Nay, and though I saw this, felt this, and was broken to pieces with it, yet that which added to my sorrow was, that I could not find with all my soul that I did desire deliverance. My heart was at times exceedingly hard. If I would not have given £1,000 for a tear, I could not shed one. No, nor sometimes scarce desire to shed one. I was both a burden and a terror to myself, nor did I ever so know, as now, what it was to be weary of my life, and yet afraid to die. How gladly would I have been anything but myself, anything but a man, in any condition but my own." Close quote. Bunyan's state of mind has distinctly pathological character. The same feelings of a total guilt, impossibility of redemption are expressed in psychotic melancholia. His feeling himself the guiltiest man on earth is a negative inflation. However, it is also alienation. Bunyan's envy of animals is something that comes up again and again in the accounts of the alienated condition that precedes religious experience. This envy of animals gives us a clue as to how the state of alienation is to be healed, namely, by renewed contact with the natural instinct of life. Although alienation is an archetypal and hence a generally human experience, exaggerated forms of the experience, such as Bunyan's, are usually found in people with a certain type of traumatic childhood. In cases where the child experiences a severe degree of rejection by the parents, the ego self-axis is damaged and the child is then predisposed in later life to states of alienation which can reach unbearable proportions. This course of events is due to the fact that the child experiences parental rejection as rejection by God. The experience is then built into the psyche as a permanent ego self-alienation. In the context of Christian psychology, the alienation experience is commonly understood as divine punishment for sin. Anselm's doctrine of sin is relevant here. According to him, sin is a robbing of God's prerogatives and thus dishonors him. This dishonor requires satisfaction. Anselm writes, "Every wish of a rational creature should be subject to the will of God. This is the sole and complete debt of honor which we owe to God, and which God requires of us. He who does not render this honor which is due to God robs God of his own dishonors him, and this is sin. Moreover, so long as he does not restore what he has taken away, he remains in fault, and it will not suffice merely to restore what has been taken away, but considering the contempt offered, he ought to restore that than he took away. For as one who imperils another's safety does not enough by merely restoring his safety, without making some compensation for the anguish incurred, so he who violates another's honor does not enough by merely rendering honor again, but must, according to the extent of the injury done, make restoration in some way satisfactory to the person whom he has dishonored. We must also observe that when anyone pays what he has unjustly taken away, he ought to give something which could not have been demanded by him, had he not stolen what belonged to another. So then, every one who sins ought to pay back the honor of which he has robbed God, and this is the satisfaction that every sinner owes to God. Sin is the inflated presumption of the ego which states over the functions of the self. This crime requires punishment, alienation, and restitution, remorse, and repentance. But according to Anselm, full satisfaction requires the return of more than was originally taken. This is impossible since man owes God total obedience even without sin. He has no extra resources to pay his penalty. For this he must use the grace provided by the sacrifice of the God-man, Jesus Christ. In the sequence of sin and repentance, God himself pays the fine by an influx of grace. This corresponds to St. Paul's statement, quote, "But where sin was thus multiplied, grace immeasurably exceeded it, in order that, as sin established in its reign by way of death, so God's grace might establish its reign in righteousness and issue in eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord." Romans 5:20-21. Paul's following question, quote, "Shall we persist in sin so that there may be all the more grace?" close quote, is of course answered in the negative. Nevertheless, the question alludes to the uncomfortable fact that the grace is somehow connected with sin. Understood psychologically, these theological doctrines refer to the relation between the ego and the self. Inflation, sin, is to be avoided when possible. When it occurs, the ego can be redeemed only by restoring to the self its honor, repentance, contrition. This, however, is not sufficient for full satisfaction. Grace derived from the self-sacrifice must complete the payment. This is even the hint that the ego's sin and subsequent penalty are necessary to generate the flow of healing energy, grace, from the self. This would correspond to the fact that the ego cannot experience the support of the self until it has been freed of its identification with self. It cannot be a vessel for the influx of grace until it is emptied of its own inflated fullness, and this emptying occurs only through the experience of alienation. Martin Luther expresses the same idea. God works by contraries so that a man feels himself to be lost in the very moment when he is on the point of being saved. When God is about to justify a man, he damns him. Whom he would make alive, he must first kill. God's favor is communicated in the form of wrath that it seems furthest when it is at hand. Man must first cry out that there is no health in him. He must be consumed with horror. This is the pain of purgatory. In this disturbance, salvation begins. When a man believes himself to be utterly lost, light breaks. 4. Restitution of the ego self-axis. There is a typical clinical picture seen very commonly in psychotherapeutic practice which might be called an alienation neurosis. An individual with such a neurosis is very dubious about his right to exist. He has a profound sense of unworthiness with all the symptoms that we commonly refer to as an inferiority complex. He assumes unconsciously and automatically that whatever comes out of himself, his innermost desires, needs, and interests, must be wrong or somehow unacceptable. With this attitude, psychic energy is dammed up and must emerge in covert, unconscious, or destructive ways such as the psychosomatic symptoms, attacks of anxiety or primitive affect, depression, suicidal impulses, alcoholism, etc. Fundamentally, such a patient is facing the problem of whether or not he is justified before God. We have here the psychological basis of the theological question of justification. Are we justified by faith or by works? Which puts into a nutshell the difference between the introverted and extroverted viewpoints. The alienated person feels profoundly unjustified and is scarcely able to act according to his own best interests. At the same time, he is cut off from a sense of meaning. Life is emptied of psychic content. In order to break out of the alienated state, some contact between ego and self must be reestablished. If this can happen, a whole new world opens up. Here is a description of such an experience which I take from a case reported by Dr. Rollo May. The patient was a 28-year-old woman who had been an illegitimate child and had suffered severely with what I would call an alienation neurosis. She reports her experience in these words. I remember walking that day under the elevated tracks in a slum area, feeling the thought, I am an illegitimate child. I recall the sweat pouring forth in my anguish and trying to accept that fact. Then I understood what it must feel like to accept. I am a Negro in the midst of privileged whites, or I am blind in the midst of people who see. Later on that night I woke up and it came to me this way. I accept the fact that I am an illegitimate child, but I am not a child anymore. So it is. I am illegitimate. That is not so either. I was born illegitimately. Then what is left? What is left is this. I am. This act of contact and acceptance with I am, once gotten hold of, gave me what I think was for me the first time the experience, since I am, I have the right to be. What is this experience like? It is primarily a feeling. It feels like receiving the deed to my house. It is the experience of my own aliveness, not caring whether it turns out to be an ion or just a wave. It is like when a very young child when a very young child I once reached the core of a peach and cracked the pit, not knowing what I would find and then feeling the wonder of finding the inner seed good to eat in its bitter sweetness. It is like a sailboat in the harbor being given an anchor so that, being made out of earthly things, it can by means of its anchor get in touch again with the earth, the ground from which its wood grew. It can lift its anchor to sail, but always at times it can cast its anchor to weather the storm or rest a little. It is like going into my very own Garden of Eden, where I am beyond good and evil and all other human concepts. It is like the globe before the mountains and oceans and continents have been drawn on it. It is like a child in grammar finding the subject of the verb in a sentence. It is this case, the subject being one's own lifespan. It is ceasing to feel like a theory towards oneself. May labels this the I am experience, which is certainly descriptively apt. It can also be understood as the restitution of the ego self-axis, which must have taken place in the context of a strong transference. The following dream of a young woman in therapy also illustrates the beginning repair of a damaged ego self-axis. She dreamt, I had been banished to the cold. barren wastes of Siberia, and am wandering about aimlessly. Then a group of soldiers on horseback approached. They threw me into the snow and proceeded to rape me one by one. 4 times this happens. I felt torn apart and paralyzed with cold. Then the fifth soldier approaches. I expect the same treatment, but to my surprise I see pity and human understanding in his eyes. Instead of raping me, he gently wraps me in a blanket and carries me to a nearby cottage. Here I am, placed by the fire and fed warm soup. I know this man is going to heal me. This dream occurred with the onset of transference. The patient had suffered as a child from a severe degree of rejection by both parents. Her father, in particular, neglected her completely after his divorce from her mother. This was a crushing blow to the patient's self-worth, and it left her alienated from the values carried by the father and ultimately a portion of the self. The dream describes vividly her feeling of alienation or banishment and also her newly emerging experience of restoration. The ego self axis was being repaired. This happens with the dawning of awareness of strong transference feelings. Such experiences are, of course, encountered regularly in psychotherapy and are usually handled more or less successfully by means of good human feeling and established theories concerning transference. However, I believe a realization that a profound nuclear process involving repair of the ego self axis is taking place gives an added dimension to the understanding of the transference phenomena. Furthermore, one is then able to understand the therapeutic experience in the larger context of man's universal need for a relation to the transpersonal source of being. Another example of the healing effect achieved by re-establishing the connection between the ego and the self is found in a remarkable dream that was brought to me. The man who had this dream had endured several severe emotional deprivation in childhood. He also was an illegitimate child, reared by foster parents who were near psychotics and who provided practically no positive parental experience for the boy. As a result, he was left with an extreme sense of alienation in adult life. Though quite talented, he was severely blocked in his efforts to realize his potentialities. He had this dream on the night following Young's death, June 6, 1961. I mention this detail because affect, he was quite affected by Young's death, and because, in a certain sense, the dream epitomizes one aspect of Young's approach to the psyche. Here is the dream. 4 of us arrive on a strange planet. The four seems to be a quaternity, in that we each represent different aspects of one being as though we were representatives of the 4 directions or the 4 different races of man. On arrival, we discover a counterpart to our group of 4 on the planet, a second group of 4. The 4 does not speak our language. In fact, each of the 4 speaks a different language. The first thing we try to do is establish some language in common. This problem occupies much of the dream, but I shall omit this portion. There is on this planet a superorder which is enforced on all its inhabitants, but it is not enforced as though by a person or a government, but by benign authority which we suppose to be nature. There is nothing threatening to the individuality about its ability to exercise this control on everyone. I am, then, distracted by something happening in an emergency chamber. One of the planet's 4 has had an attack. It seems that his excitement over our arrival has caused his heart to beat too fast, and it is in the nature of the superorder to intervene when things of this sort happen. He is placed in a semi-comatose state during which he is plugged into the master heartbeat, which will absorb the overload until he has been equilibriumized. I begin to wonder if the 4 of us will be allowed to stay. Then we receive the information that we will be allowed to stay on the condition that we may be placed on wavelengths so that the central source of energy law will be able to measure and detect we get into the planet calls danger and what the earth calls sin. At the moment we enter into danger, the superorder will take over until the condition has been corrected. Danger will be whenever an act is performed for the immediate gratification of the ego or any conscious part of the personality, rather than with reference to the archetypal roots of that act. That is, without relating that act to its archetypal origin and the aspect of ritual that was involved in the first root act. The central feature of this most impressive dream is the superorder and central source of energy law that exists on another planet, the unconscious. This remarkable image is a symbolic expression of the transpersonal regulating process of the psyche and corresponds to a concept of the compensatory function of the unconscious. The dream states that danger arises whenever an act is performed for the immediate gratification of the ego. Without reference to the archetypal roots of that act, this is an exact description of inflation in which the ego operates without reference to the supra-personal categories of existence. Furthermore, the dream equates this condition with sin, a precise equivalent to Augustine's view as quoted previously. The dream tells us that the superorder goes into effect to remove the overload as soon as the ego becomes inflated, thus protecting against the dangers of subsequent alienation. This protective or compensating mechanism is a close parallel to Walter Cannon's principle of homeostasis in physiology. According to this concept, the body has built-in processes of homeostasis, or self-regulation, which will not permit the basic body constituents to get too far out of the proper balance. For instance, if we ingest too much sodium chloride, the kidneys increase the concentration of sodium chloride in the urine. Or, if too great a concentration of carbon dioxide accumulates in the blood, then certain nerve centers in the brain increase the respiratory rate in order to blow off the excess carbon dioxide. The same self-regulating, homeostatic process works in the psyche, providing it is free to operate naturally and has not been damaged. Like the body, the unconscious psyche has instinctive wisdom which cannot correct the errors and excesses of consciousness if we are open to its messages. This corrective function derives from the self and requires a living, healthy connection between self and ego in order to operate freely. Even for the normal man, alienation is a necessary experience if psychological development is to proceed because ego self-identity is as universal as original sin. Indeed, they are identical. Carlyle has put it cleverly. He says that happiness is inversely proportionate to the quantity of our expectations, i.e., how much we think we are entitled to. Happiness equals what we have, divided by what we expect. He writes, by certain valuations and averages of our own striking, we come upon some sort of average terrestrial lot. This we fancy belongs to us by nature, and of indefeasible right. It is simple payment of wages, of our deserts, requires neither thanks nor complaint. Only such overplus as there may be do we account happiness. Any deficit again is misery. Now consider that we have the valuation of our own deserts of ourselves, and what a fund of conceit there is in each of us. Do you wonder that the balance should so often dip the wrong way? I tell thee, blockhead, it all comes of thy vanity, of thou fanciest those same deserts of thine to be. Fancy that thou deservest to be hanged, as is most likely, thou wilt feel it happiness to be only shot. The fraction of life can be increased in value not so much by increasing your numerator as by lessening your denominator. Nay, unless my algebra deceive me, unity itself divided by zero will give infinity. Make thy claim of wages a zero, then thou hast the world under thy feet. Well, well did the wisest of our time write, it is only with renunciation that life, properly speaking, can be said to begin.